My talk today is focused on material and digital enclosures in northwest China. In order to understand what's happening to the Uyghurs, which is a Turkic Muslim group that lives in northwest China, that calls it their ancestral homeland, we have to go back to the 1990s, which is when China was becoming a manufacturer for the world and was needing raw materials to drive their economy. And one of the sources of those raw materials was in northwest China, a massive space the size of Alaska, where the Uyghurs are from, as well as other Turkic and other native groups. When the migrants arrived in that space and began to build out the infrastructure to get at the natural resources that were located there, they first built the hard infrastructure, the pipelines, the railways, all of the things that were necessary to get access to oil and natural gas, which around 20% of Chinese oil and natural gas is from this region. Over time, they built up a service sector that supported the resource extraction economy, and then they began to build out industrial scale agriculture. And so by as recently as last year, this region now produces around 85% of Chinese cotton, as well as around a quarter of the world's tomatoes. Now, the Uyghurs and the Kazakhs, who are the two largest groups in this region, together around 13.5 million people, were largely excluded from that new economy. Instead, they were pushed into kinds of tenant farming in the agricultural sector. And they also saw the cost of living begin to rise. This made Uyghurs increasingly desperate to find a way forward into the new economy. They were excluded from the more lucrative sectors of the economy due to discrimination, which was systematic throughout the region. Job ads simply said, no Uyghurs need apply. In 2010, a new element was built into this system, an element that began to move from a sort of material enclosure of space, all of that infrastructure that was being built, the hard infrastructure, to a kind of softer infrastructure, a digital enclosure that was facilitated by 3G networks. So when I began my first year of fieldwork in the region in 2011, I was meeting all of these young Uyghur men in regional centers who were buying smartphones for the first time and were learning how to use a new app called WeChat, which is a social media app that was authorized by the Chinese state. It's owned by a company called Tencent and allows people to send voice messages to each other. This was a game changer for Uyghurs. Prior to this, Uyghurs had to use either Chinese or kind of invent an alphabet using Latin script that would allow them to communicate in their own language. Now they could simply speak into device and send messages to each other. The other thing that the oral messages did is it allowed Uyghurs to circumvent much of the surveillance systems, the censorship systems that are in place in China. As I was conducting my fieldwork, I was seeing lots of young men using their smartphones to organize in communities in migrant enclaves in urban areas. They were looking for jobs, and they were also looking for more freedom. When I began my second year of fieldwork in 2014 and 15, I met lots of young men who were going to the mosque in the city and were organizing themselves in these mosque communities, mostly using WeChat. They talked about the mosque space as a space where there was a kind of censorship system in place that prevented them from fully embracing what they called real Islam. But they said that online, on their smartphones, they could talk about real Islam, the Islam that they were learning about from people in diaspora, from people in Turkey and Egypt, and also among themselves. They didn't realize at the time that they were leaving a digital footprint. By May 2014, the state had become quite concerned about the kind of efflorescence of Uyghur culture and Uyghur religious practice that was facilitated by the internet. And so as they declared the People's War on Terror in response to several violent incidents, one of which was described as China's 9/11, they began to target religious practice itself. And so in the neighborhoods where I was living at the time, I began to see these posters erected everywhere that said it's no longer permitted for women to veil themselves, for men to have beards, or to have Islamic symbols on their clothing. Within the space of 3 or 4 years, the state began to enact a quite dense digital enclosure that began to capture digital traffic that was coming out of the Uyghur community. It was an alliance between state security and private industry and was supported by the hiring of over 90,000 new police officers. The initial goal of this system was to break the autonomy of the Uyghur internet, but over time it became more of an actual control system, one that prevented people from moving and from speaking freely in any form at all. There's now 1,400 tech firms that are working in this space. Some of the tools that they've developed are tools to automate the transcription, translation, and assessment of Uyghur speech. This is a tool that allows the voice memo system that was being used on WeChat to be assessed by the state and these private companies. The other thing that's being built by a number of different companies is automated detection of Uyghur and Kazakh faces using surveillance video. So these are real-time detection systems that will simply read the phenotypes of a person's face, the shapes of their eyes and nose, in order to detect whether or not they are Uyghur or Kazakh. And if the person is on a watch list, the police will be alerted to their presence. By 2017, the state had dispersed a new set of tools called counterterrorism swords, which are a kind of digital forensics tool that can be plugged into someone's phone and can assess their digital history. It scans through the person's device in a matter of minutes and looks for markers of religious or political activity. The number of markers that are looked for range between 50,000 and 75,000 different markers. And of course, the list grows over time as more and more phones and devices are assessed. In my interviews with police officers who did some of these scans, they said that they would receive readings on the counterterrorism sword that alerted them to the fact that the person whose phone they were scanning had been going to the mosque regularly, had worn a hijab or had pictures of people wearing hijabs, had a beard, had contact with people in Muslim-majority countries, had listened to unauthorized religious teachings, had become a member of a religious study group on WeChat, had studied Arabic or Turkish, or had just simply used a VPN, a virtual private network, to circumvent the censorship system in China, something that's quite common throughout China, or had used WhatsApp on their phone. Those that were assessed as untrustworthy through these scans were then sent to a new system of camps, a kind of re-education camp system that the state has described as vocational education and training centers. Now, when we look at the government bid contracts for these camps, we can see quite clearly that these are not schools in a normative sense, that these are smart camps, that's how they're often described, that use surveillance systems throughout them, that have razor wire at the perimeter. The guards carry non-lethal weapons, and the detainees are held in locked cells. It's really more of a medium security prison that has an educational component to it, often through distance learning that is on the screens that are up on the walls in the cells, and also in fortified classrooms. In mid-2018, we began to see detainees being transferred from camps to other spaces. And we also began to notice documents from the government that talked about the way the camps were becoming a carrier of the economy. They began to talk about how the human labor that was coming out of the camps was another additional resource like oil and natural gas that could drive the economy in that part of China. Now, most of these factories are centered on cotton production or textile production that's connected to cotton production, which makes a lot of sense. As I mentioned already, 85% of Chinese cotton comes from this region. And already jobs are leaving China to go to places like Vietnam or Bangladesh because in eastern China, the cost of labor is rising. Now there's this new subject population coming out of these camps, held in place by these camps and the surveillance system that can be put to work. One of the women I interviewed in 2020 in Kazakhstan, where I conducted interviews with around 40 people that had come across the border recently. One of them was this woman, Gulzira Alkhan, who was found guilty of watching Turkish TV shows and of traveling to Kazakhstan, of having a passport, of being under the age of 55, all markers of her potential untrustworthiness, and had spent about a year in a camp, and then was released for several days and then sent to work in a factory that was 7 kilometers from the camp she had been held previous. When she arrived in the factory, she recognized her boss, this man, his name is Wang Xinghua, who had come to the camp several times, had stuck his head in her cell and had selected her to be a worker in his factory. Here he's speaking in a state-sponsored interview, talking about how the factory is creating 2,000 jobs for Kazakhs and Uyghurs, and is generating $6 million in sales in 2019 or 2018. What he doesn't mention in his interview is that he was paying Gulzira and the other workers only around 300 yuan, which was around $50 per month. And on top of that, a penny and a half per pair of gloves that they made. This is less than a sixth of the minimum wage in the region. And so Gulzira said, you can see from this that it was a kind of slavery. He's also not mentioning that the surveillance systems suffuse this factory space, that there's checkpoints that workers go through as they enter, where they have their ID scanned, where their bodies are checked for any sort of tool that they might be taking from the factory space. He's not mentioning that Gulzira and the others were held in a dormitory at night, where they were watched by state workers, that their phones were checked several times a day, that if they tried to leave the factory or dormitory and go through one of those checkpoints, an alarm would sound and the police would be summoned. So Gulzira said, you can see from this that the entire region is a kind of open-air prison, that even if you're not inside the camp, you are still within an enclosure. So what does all of this mean? Well, in some sense, what's happening to the Uyghurs is part of capitalist frontier making, or the building of the market economy more generally. Material enclosure is central to the original accumulation of capital in market economies. This is something that Karl Marx referred to as primitive accumulation. In order to begin this process, the land that's held in common needs to be monetized and turned into commodities. The way that this is enacted in many cases is through a legal regime of property ownership, through wage labor, and the capture of social relationships and behavior. In this case, in the Uyghur case, it's the global war on terror and a legal apparatus around that that's being used to justify the detention of Uyghurs and Kazakhs. Now, it's important to understand that capitalist frontier making is a feature, not a bug, of all of market economies. We're always in a race to the bottom. In digital enclosure, which are systems that begin to capture social relations in the mind in order to extend the logic of the factory and workhouse, are something that are being used throughout contemporary capitalist systems. In the West, most of these systems, particularly when it's targeting protected citizens, are often focused more on the consumption and making consumption practices more efficient, increasing advertising, making it more precise. But it also has a carceral aspect to it as well, particularly when it's pointed towards vulnerable populations. Now, in the United States, for instance, this often has the effect of pushing undocumented people, black and brown people, into a gray economy on the margins of society, into forms of labor that are slightly at the side of the surveillance systems. In the Uyghur region, something different is happening. They're not only being banished to prisons, but they're not being allowed to leave. They're not being forced into forms of deportation or into ghettos. Instead, they're being pushed into factory work. The private public tech that's building the matrix of assessment, control, and removal in these systems is being used to hold the targeted population in place and put them to work as a class of unfree workers in the re-education labor regime. For now, the system requires an army of unfree data police, checkpoints, and camps in order to be operationalized, which means that the system that's targeting the Uyghurs is going to be difficult to replicate in other places. It will take a great deal of economic and political will to put it in motion. But that's not to say that these systems don't travel in some ways, because we see similar technologies being used at the southern border of the United States and in places like Palestine and Kashmir, all at the same time, just to slightly different effects. So thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to a great discussion.